Hello again, everybody. This is Pastor Tony, and welcome to another Word in Season. A word of encouragement for you here at the end of this week. In fact, today we are commemorating what we call Good Friday, remembering the fact that Jesus became our substitute and sacrifice, went to the cross for us, and was crucified on that day. And then it culminates on Easter Sunday in remembering and rehearsing the fact that God raised Jesus from the dead. After Jesus became sin for us, after he suffered on the cross, and then he was buried for 3 days and 3 nights, on the third day, we know that God raised him from the dead. But how does that impact our life? Well, just those events alone, they happened, and they are real, and they majorly impacted the spiritual realm. But it's not really going to have a great effect on your life until you have a revelation of those and how that affects you and me personally, individually. You know, there's a story that I just love in the Word of God. It's over in Luke chapter 24, and I'm going to convey that to you for the most part, and then I will maybe read a couple of things in that. But this is the story of the two disciples that were on their way from Jerusalem to Emmaus, on the road to Emmaus. And this was late in the day, the day that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. And they were walking along and talking about the events of that weekend. But they still didn't have much of a revelation of it. And so they were walking along, but Jesus all of a sudden pulled up beside them and asked them what they were talking about and why they were sad. See, they still didn't get a revelation of they still didn't really believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, even though they heard some rumors to that effect that his body was not in that tomb. They just could not get their hearts and minds around that. So Jesus said, well, what are you talking about? And why are you sad? And they began to say to him, you know, are you the only stranger in this area and you don't know the events of what's just happened here, about Jesus being crucified, delivered up and crucified, and then dying? And then they said this, and you know they were looking down and probably sad about this whole thing. They said, we had hoped that it was him that was the Messiah who was going to redeem Israel. But, you know, Jesus was sitting there, and he was just kind of disguised. They didn't recognize who he was. And I'm waiting for the movie to come out on this one, all right? I would love to see this right here. And so, you know, they began to convey all these stories, and they said, well, you know, even the women went down there to the tomb, and they didn't find his body there, and so they were just confused at this point. And so Jesus said to them in verse 25 there in Luke 24, he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all the things that the prophets had spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? Notice he said, you know, even though they were disciples, he said, you are slow to believe. You're just not believing what the prophet said. And they didn't really believe what Jesus said. Jesus told them over and over again, I'm going to the cross, and I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to lay my life down, and then the third day I'm going to be resurrected from the dead. Over and over again he told them that. But it just went in one ear and out the other. And they didn't believe that at all. In fact, they didn't have any signs saying, welcome back, Jesus. They weren't welcoming, you know, sitting there waiting for him to come back. They believed he was dead and gone, and their hopes were dashed. And so he said, you're slow of heart to believe. And verse 27, and he began at Moses and all the prophets, and he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. All those things written in the law of Moses, the prophets, the Psalms, they were all about Jesus. They foretold about Jesus coming, being crucified, and then being resurrected on the third day. And he was the Redeemer. But, you know, even at this point, they still didn't believe it. So they drew near to the village where they were going, and evening was coming, and dark was on the horizon. And so Jesus he acted like he would just keep on going, but they compelled him and constrained him to stay with them. So he stayed with them, and they sat down, and he broke bread. He broke the bread and gave them the cup, just like he had done right before he went to the cross to become sin for them. And this time, their eyes were open. All of a sudden, they recognized who Jesus was. And then Jesus vanished out of their sight. Now, why is that? Well, because The revelation of Jesus under this new covenant replaces the eyewitness or the visible appearance of Jesus. See, Jesus can't stay down here all the time, so he gives us that revelation. The eyes of our heart should be more real. What we see through the eyes of our heart should be more real than what we see with these eyes. And that's the pattern that Jesus established here under the new covenant. And so they recognized him. And so rather than just staying there, they all of a sudden packed their bags and headed back the 7 miles to Jerusalem. They were refreshed. They were strengthened again. And they made this statement. They said, "Did not our hearts burn within us as he began to open the scriptures and began to reveal those things concerning himself?" See, they went from being slow of heart to having a burning heart. What carried them? What made that difference? What brought them from being slow of heart to believe over into a place of having a burning heart where they were refreshed, strengthened, and went back to Jerusalem to tell their brethren what had happened? Well, it was the revelation from the Word of God about Jesus. And see, all those events, Jesus was resurrected, standing there right in front of them, but their natural eyesight just, it failed in all of this. Their natural understanding and their reasoning, it just failed in this whole thing right here. But it was when that revelation knowledge of the resurrected Jesus hit their heart, they went from slow of heart to believe into a burning heart, refreshed, strengthened, and ready to go. And see, that's what's going to make the difference in our life. It's not just looking at the events, the eyewitness accounts of what Jesus did. It's not just knowing certain scriptures, singing certain songs, and seeing certain plays. All those things are good, but it's having that deep-rooted revelation of who Jesus is and his death, burial, and resurrection, and how that impacts our life. That's what's going to stay with you, not just this weekend, but all year long. You're going to be refreshed as you feed upon that revelation of Jesus. You're going to go from a slow of heart to believe into a burning heart, full of life, full of joy, and full of peace. And that's what this thing is all about. Well, that's all the time I've got for today. I hope you've been encouraged by these words this week. Be strong, be courageous, celebrate big time, rejoice in the resurrection, and we'll see you next week.